So you mentioned the Trump administration tariffs, and I think it is important to reiterate that many of these tariffs are still in place under the Biden administration. How have you seen the companies at U.S.-China Business Council and the other American businesses doing work with China affected by these tariffs?
Well, it's a very interesting question because a lot of our trade is in services, and the services industry is not affected by tariffs, except in terms of sentiment and kind of an overall drag on productivity. But the services industry has done very well despite the tariffs and is doing very well. And that would certainly be true in many areas, but not all areas of the services industry. Obviously, we need to take COVID into account when discussing travel and tourism and whatnot. But services have not been greatly affected by the tariffs. Because of the exclusion process, agricultural trade is in many cases doing well. Certainly across the commodity areas exclusions have been granted. Where we don't see the exclusions and where people are really suffering is where the tariffs remain high, and that would be true in most specialty areas and in horticulture. So, for example, ginseng is a major export from Wisconsin, but they're hit by the tariffs. A lot of the fruit and vegetable exports that had really been picking up from California, Oregon, and Washington State, as well as other countries other states have really been hammered by the tariffs. But I'd say that agricultural commodities generally doing well. But agricultural specialty products have been hit. On the energy side, tariffs exclusions have been granted for LNG and crude oil, and my understanding that thermal coal is moving as well, if not other. Metallurgical coal is moving, not thermal coal. And so the impact of the tariffs has really been differentiated. I would say that the biggest victims of the tariff have been small, medium-sized American manufacturers, many in the Midwest, who have relied on Chinese providers for their tooling, for spare parts, for parts, for services software, for engineering, and many of those who lack the flexibility and the resources of the multinational companies have gone out of business, or they are competing against German, Japanese, or Chinese competitors who have access to cheaper cost Chinese inputs. And so even if this is an American product made in America with some Chinese parts and components, they're at a disadvantage in the US market, much less the export market, relative to those who are not paying the tariff on that same Chinese import, perhaps in a maquiladora setting in Canada or elsewhere. And so the biggest victims of the tariffs have been American small, medium-sized manufacturers who had benefited from cheaper Chinese inputs, and their competitors are still benefiting from that, but they are denied that and suffering as a result, even here in our home market. So these tariffs have had a very deleterious effect on total factor productivity throughout the American manufacturing sector. And hopefully they'll be gone. I think that the steel and aluminum tariffs are perhaps a good example of the harm done. Sure, there are some steel and aluminum smelters that have benefited from them, and the steel and aluminum workers there have probably benefited. But there are more than 10 times as many um, workers in manufacturing that use aluminum and steel, and they're having to purchase their steel at sometimes 2 or 3 times the price of global steel.
Oh,
And if
wow.
that's having a dramatic impact on American manufacturers that use steel and aluminum, both for domestic sales and sales abroad. And until the pricing it comes down to normal global pricing, then we hold ourselves at a disadvantage. So I'm hopeful that this is something that USTR and the Department of Commerce is going to look at. And if you are following a foreign policy for the American middle class, American workers, then now's a great time to review those tariffs, because the American middle class and American workers are suffering as a result of the inefficiencies created for American manufacturers and American consumers by this ill thought out economic experiment.